over here, that would have been a huge red flag of malingering. But it's not there. He didn't obtain anything improbable, anything indefinite. He could have had, he doesn't, he could have had everything here. And even if he had had all 8 in indeterminate, it does not necessarily mean malingering. It just means see what other data you've got. Because it may be that the person's being honest responder, it may be that they're malingering, so I would have to check. And then we have honest responder. And in Mr. Newman's case, we have 5 out of his 8 scales fell in honest, and 3 fell in indeterminate, with one of them, severity, being almost, right here, severity being almost at honest. So as a whole, when I look at this, the information that I gather is that the symptoms that he's reporting to me are not likely to be malingering, that he's likely being an honest responder about the types of symptoms that he's experiencing and the severity of symptoms that he's experiencing. Now, within each of these, so if I really want to do overkill, I could look at what we call the total score. So the total score is I literally would go through the tests and actually add up all of the points. That's another way that I could come up with a cutoff of whether or not the person is malingering or not. So when you have indeterminate, I just to do it, basically, I counted all his scores, and he obtained a total score of, I think it's up here, of 51, and the cutoff for malingering there is 71. So if he obtains a total of 71, that's indication of malingering. Anything less than 71 is indication that's more consistent with somebody that's honestly responding. So his cutoff was nowhere near close. And then there's another way that we could go even further.
Your Honor, again, I object to the narrative.
The same.
Let's step back and talk about the scales that he came out indeterminate on.
Okay.
You said the first one was severity.
Severity, yes, that's one of them.
What were the things that he responded to that gave him a 4 in severity?
He endorsed to having thoughts of suicide, having strange or disturbing thoughts, hearing voices that are not really there, and being very depressed.
Now, are these questions asking whether you've had that symptom any time in your life or at that moment?
At that moment.
And the next one was selectivity of symptoms. What were the things that he responded to that gave him a 10 in selectivity?
He said that he experienced having thoughts of suicide. He had some difficulty having too much energy. He had some difficulty with having strange or disturbing thoughts, some difficulty waking up early in the morning, some difficulty hearing voices that are not really there, some difficulty being irritated with others, some difficulty being very depressed. At times, he sleeps too much. At times, he said it was the opposite of not sleeping enough. And expressing strong feelings, he has some difficulty with that, and overreacting to difficult situations.
And what sorts of things did he deny in that section?
In selectivity, he denied having any problems with people reading his mind. He denied having any problems with getting motivated. He denied any problems communicating with other planets. He denied any problems with making everyday decisions. He denied any problems fighting evil forces. He denied any problems being organized. He denied any problems trying to be successful, and there were several others that he denied.
And then the next section, blatant symptoms. How are those questions structured?
Okay. So in blatant symptoms, he endorsed 4 out of, looks like 15. I can't see, let me see. Okay, and the symptoms that he endorsed, he scored an 8 out of 15 questions. He endorsed having thoughts of suicide, and he said that when he experiences those symptoms are unbearable. He endorsed having strange or disturbing thoughts. He endorsed hearing voices that are not really there and being very depressed. And then there were, 11 others that he did not endorse.
Now, were there things that he endorsed but that he did not say were unbearable?
Correct. There were many items that he endorsed that he said he had the problem, but it was not so bad that it was unbearable. And some of those would be, I would have to take a look at it.
Looking at the ones that he scored indeterminate on, were any of those close to the top of the indeterminate range? In other words, close to probable?
Now, blatant was in the middle between honest and probable. This is blatant, and that puts him right in the middle. And then we have severity right here, and he scored a 10. He would have needed an 18 in order to put him at probable. He was 8 points away from probable and 5 points away from honest. And then 4 for severity, and he would have needed a 10 to put him at probable. And if he had scored 1 less, that would have put him at honest.
Does the manual give statistics for the range of responses for honest and malingering respondents to each of these scales?
It does. It gives it gives some statistics of, for each specific scale, what an honest responder for that particular scale, what their score might actually be versus what the score might actually be for somebody that's malingering, and then also what you would expect the range to be for each of those.
And how does Hemy compare to those statistics?
When I looked at the table, he was well below the mean, or well below average, for all 3 of those scales that were indeterminate. And that was another indication that there was no indication of malingering. His responses on those 3 scales specifically were more consistent with what honest responders responded than what malingerers responded.
Now let's talk about supplementary scales. Does the test have a way of looking at the responses beyond the 8 scales?
There are multiple, let me count them here, 5 I think. Yep, 5 supplementary scales. The inconsistent scale is one of the ones that we tend to look at. Inconsistent is this: the individual is asked a series of 16 questions at the very beginning, such as, do you have any major problems with people reading your mind? If they say yes, then you ask, is it unbearable? If they say no, then you just score it as a 0. And then you go on, you put it on there, and then you go on, and then you get to question 70. And then in question 70, we tell them, I would like to go over several earlier questions to make sure I have the correct information. We go back, and we ask them the exact same 16 items. And I'm looking to see if they are giving me the second time round the same response in terms of, was this a problem that they endorsed 54 items ago? And if this was a problem that they endorsed, is it the same level of severity that they endorsed 54 items ago? And we do this twice. We do this at the beginning, and then we do this after item 70. We give them another set of 16 questions, and then we go back again at the end. So there are a total of 32 questions where we're looking for inconsistencies in responding. Malingerers will be inconsistent. They will not remember what they said 50 items ago versus later. Or they might remember that they endorsed it, but they may not remember how severe they endorsed it. And so we're looking for inconsistency in how they're responding about their problems. With Mr. Neuman, he scored a score of 1 out of 32. And the one that was inconsistent was having too much energy. Do you have any major problems with having too much energy? When I first asked him that, he said yes, and he said it was not unbearable. And then the second time he said that yes, there were times that it was unbearable, having too much energy. And that was the only inconsistency.
And how effective is that particular supplementary scale in terms of indicating malingering?
It's another piece to the puzzle of figuring out whether somebody is malingering or not. It's another piece of data.
Is in the manual to suggest that a high level of education or a high level of intelligence would decrease the effectiveness of this test?
No, there is not.
Why did you do 2 different tests for malingering?
For this particular case, I chose to do 2 specific malingering inventories because of the nature of this case, because I knew that this is one where...
Objection, Your Honor.
Relevance.
Relevance.
Sustain. Let's rephrase that question.
Did you do more tests in this case than you would typically do?
Objection, relevance.
Sustain. Rephrase question.
Why did you do it?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
I stopped mid-question.
Can you voice up, counsel, if you don't mind?
Yes, Your Honor. Okay. Let me ask you this. What is the conclusion that you reached from the test that you did on malingering?
The conclusion is that there is no indication of malingering based on the tests. I have one that's telling me under reporting, and I have 2 specific measures of malingering that are saying not malingering. And those corroborate my impressions that I obtained separately from the testing.
Okay. Dr. Flores, you indicated earlier that there were many things that you did as part of this evaluation. One of those was spending time with Mr. Neuman and interviewing him. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Did he cooperate with you during the interviews?
Yes, he did.
Did he admit that he planned to shoot Rusty Sneiderman?
He did.
Did he admit that he purchased a disguise?
He did.
Did he admit that he purchased a gun?
He did.
Did he admit that he went back and spoke to the man he purchased the gun from about not disclosing that to the police?
Yes, he did.
Did he admit to, or did he discuss the shooting of Rusty Sneiderman with you?
He did.
Did he admit to throwing the gun in the lake or disposing of the gun?
Yes, he told me about it.
Why did he say that he shot Rusty Sneiderman?
He said he shot Rusty Sneiderman because he thought Rusty Sneiderman's kids were in danger and that he needed to protect them.
Did he give any explanation for why he wore a disguise when he did this?
Yes, he said that Andrew Sneiderman could not find out that he was the one that had killed Rusty Sneiderman.
Now, in your evaluation, is it important to address the earlier parts of Hemy's life and his childhood?
I believe it is, yes, it is.
And did you talk to Hemy about that, about his childhood?
I did. I talked extensively with him about his childhood.
And I think you indicated that you also spoke with his father?
I did.
And his mother?
Yes, I did.
And his sister?
Yes.
And an aunt and a cousin?
Yes, and a cousin's wife also.
Okay. And Dr. Flores, let me ask you regarding Hemy Neuman's early childhood, just the dynamics in the home between Hemy and his parents and his sister. Were there issues?
Closer to the microphone, counsel, to make sure everybody can hear you. Please.
Talking about Hemy's early childhood and just the dynamics between Hemy and his parents and his sister, are there issues that you considered significant?
Yes, there are.
Okay, can you tell me about those?
Mr. Neuman grew up in a home that could be characterized as highly dysfunctional. There was...
I'm going to object to any hearsay in this answer insofar as the question is limited to what the defendant told the witness and what the witness found relevant to her opinion. I have no objection. Insofar as the witness is conveying what others told her, I have no hearsay objection.
Response.
Your Honor, what I'm asking her is what Hemy told her, so I can make that clear in the question. But what I'm asking her is what she found out in her interview with Mr. Neuman.
Sure. I'm going to sustain the objection as far as if you can ask her questions pertaining to what Mr. Neuman may or may not have said to her, but that's what the response needs to be based on at this time. So if she says Mr. Neumann said X, Y, and Z, I will allow that. So, you may continue.
We're talking about your interviews with Hemy.
Yes.
Right. Can you tell me from your interviews with Hemy what was important about his early childhood?
He actually did describe his childhood as dysfunctional. His home, he used the word dysfunctional. He spoke about physical abuse by his father. He spoke about his father drinking excessively, being an alcoholic. He talked about being emotionally, he and his little sister, who was 18 months younger than him, would be left to fend for themselves in terms of home. The mother would be traveling, socializing, playing bridge, and not really attending to the children. They would be left in the care of maids at the house when they lived in Puerto Rico. He used the word abandoned, that he felt abandoned. Never really felt really loved by his father, and his mother was really physically not really present for a good part of his life.
Okay. What did he tell you about specifically about abuse?
He talked about his father being abusive, hitting him, punching him. At meal times, if there was any food left at the table, the children were not eating. There were occasions in which the father actually took their head and actually pushed it into the food so that they would not leave any food. And this was information relayed to me by Mr. Neumann and by other sources, including Mr. Newman's dad.
Just talking about your interviews with Hemy.
So I'm going to sustain that portion. Obviously, Ms. Anson, she can articulate what Mr. Neumann said to her, and I will overrule the objection, but at the end she said other sources, which implies communication from someone other than Mr. Neumann. So I would ask you to ask questions that elicit responses from the witness pertaining to what Mr. Neumann may or may not have said. Please.
Yes, Your Honor. Just talking about your interviews with Hemy Neuman.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Did he give any other examples of physical abuse?
Yes, being punched. His father also being physically violent with his sister. Mr. Neumann reported to me that to protect his sister, he would actually take the blame for things that the sister had done so that she would not get beaten by the father.
Does Hemy have clear memories of all of his childhood?
No, he has gaps in memory leading up to about age 13 or so. He has big gaps in memory.
Okay. And does the fact that you have no conscious memory of a traumatic event mean that it has no psychological effect on you?
Most definitely not, no.
And can childhood abuse or trauma be linked to mental illness?
It has been. We know that individuals that have a childhood trauma history, the childhood trauma history places them at higher risk for developing mental illness. And with bipolar disorder, one of the things that we know is that specifically a childhood trauma history places individuals also at higher likelihood of experiencing psychosis at some point down the line.
Okay. Just talking about your interview with Hemy, are there assaults on his sister Monique that are important or relevant to your diagnosis?
There are.
Can you tell me about that?
His sister has a history of childhood sexual abuse.
Objection, Your Honor.
Lawyer's approach. All right, I'm going to sustain the objection as far as the witness will be able to articulate whatever Mr. Newman may or may not have said correctly. Sustain that last objection.
Let me ask you why what happened to someone else is relevant to the delusions that Hemy Neuman suffered.
Because I think they are correlated with why it was that he was experiencing that particular type of delusion at the time that he shot Mr. Sneiderman.
Okay. Tell me more about what delusion and how they're correlated.
The specific delusion that he had was that the children were in danger and that he needed to protect them. And he needed to protect them so that they did not experience the anguish, is the word he used, that he experienced growing up. And he also spoke about throughout his life having felt feelings of guilt about not having protected his sister from things that had happened to her.
Okay.
And having lots of difficulty coping with those feelings of guilt of not having protected when he had the chance, or when he thought he had the chance.
And did he tell you about a specific incident that he witnessed and was involved with?
Yes, there was a specific incident that he witnessed in which he told me that his sister was actually being sexually assaulted. She was a child. He was about 10 or 11 years old. And he had gotten on like a 5th floor window ledge so he could try to see what was going on in the room that his sister was in, locked up with a relative. And he'd gotten to the window, and he had knocked and knocked and knocked and knocked, and the relative had stopped the sexual assault of his sister.
Okay. And how is that relevant then to his symptoms?
Well, first of all, he actually did not recall that incident, which is part of that whole having gaps of memory, and he did not recall the incident until later. And in terms of how it relates, I think it goes toward this sort of innate need. He calls it a drive, that he had this drive to protect Mr. Rusty Sneiderman's children, and he compares that to the drive that he felt that day in his attempts at protecting his sister from the sexual assault, that he had to just do this thing, and he went up to the 5th floor, ended up developing some fears of height after that.
Okay. And was there another incident that he actually witnessed relating to protecting a child that was important?
Yes. He also spoke about having some feelings of guilt, also about not having protected a girl. I think he said he was in the 5th grade, and he had witnessed some older teenagers groping and grabbing in a sexual way a young girl, and he had stood there and watched, and he talked about feeling guilty that he had never protected her.
Now let me move forward to when Hemy was 13. Was there a significant change in his life at that time?
Yes, there was.
Can you summarize for us what happened when he was 13?
When he was 13, his mother was not at home. She was traveling somewhere, and his dad one day basically told him that he was going to be going to boarding school in Israel, and he did not speak Hebrew then. And his brother at the time was in college on the East Coast, and so his dad put his brother and Mr. Neuman in the car at the time that he was going to drive. The older brother was going to fly out to college in the East Coast, and so they were both taken to the airport. And the one brother got on the plane to go to college, and Mr. Neuman was given a piece of paper by his dad that basically said, it basically had his own phone number from home, which he knew, he said, and then it also had, I believe it was an address of where he was to go to when he landed in Israel. And that was it. There was no I love you, there was not I will see you, there was not...
I object to the commentary, Your Honor.
Sustain.
Okay, just talking about what happened.
So he gets in the plane, and he lands at the airport in Israel, and it is really late at night. The flight was delayed and arrived there later than it was expected. And when he got there, there was nobody there waiting for him to take him to the boarding school, and so he hailed a cab, I believe it was, had the address to the boarding school, and so he, at around midnight or so, he lands at the boarding school in Israel, and this was, I think it was like in the fall. It was a little chilly, he said, and he lands there, and he remembers being met by the guy that opened the gate. He said it was this like old scary guy, kind of like the Hunchback of Notre Dame kind of thing is how he described him. It was scary for him. He was 13 at the time, and so this is now where he is. He's at the boarding school. For the first 3 weeks or so, he was sickly. He developed, I think, strep throat, and he was sickly, and so he would be in the infirmary quite a bit for those first 3 weeks. And then after that, there came a point in which there was a Jewish religious holiday. I think it was Rosh Hashanah, and this boarding school had most of the kids would go home on weekends, or they would go home for holidays. And while Mr. Neuman said that subsequently he found out that there were in fact lots of relatives that he had there, at the time that he was there, he didn't know that there were any relatives there. And so one day he's in the infirmary, and it's...
Your Honor, I object to the narrative.
All right. Counsel, you do have a right to ask her questions, but she has a right to respond. But as far as it's a valid objection as far as responding in a narrative form. Sustained. Next question.
Was there an issue with him needing to leave the school?
Was there an issue with him?
Needing to leave the school.
Yes. There came a point in when Rosh Hashanah was happening, and they were going to close the school. The school was going to close down for the holiday. All the kids and staff were going to leave, and Mr. Neuman did not have anywhere to stay. And so there was a nurse that had been attending to him while he had been sick, and she found out that from him that he didn't have anywhere to go, and so she went ahead and she took him home with her for the holiday weekend.
And was this something that continued happening as far as holidays and the school closing?
Yes. After that holiday, then there were other occasions in which kids would go home for the weekend, and the school would close, and Mr. Neuman would have nowhere to go, and so other peers or staff would take him with them for that period of time until school resumed again.
And did there come a time where he refused to continue doing that?
Yes, he said that he got to the point where he didn't want people taking pity on him anymore, and so during one of these closings of the school, there did come a day where he refused to go with anybody, and he stayed at this boarding school that had a farm. It had like a dairy farm and whatnot, and he stayed there by himself.
And was that a significant event?
It was a significant event, yes.
And can you describe that holiday that he stayed at the farm?
Right. So when he stayed at this farm, he described having been placed in what he referred to as a shack. And he described being very, very cold, and that somebody, he doesn't know who, but somebody would come by and they would put food outside his door. And the way that he described it is that he felt like he was a dog or a puppy with the food being left outside this shack door.
And can you describe how that event made him feel in terms of emotionally or in terms of his diagnosis?
I object to the speculation. The witness can answer how Mr. Neuman described it feeling to her. I object to the question, how did it make him feel?
All right. I was saying, rephrase that question, Counsel. Articulate as far as what the witness articulated. What's right? What Mr. Neuman may have said to her. Rephrase.
What did he tell you about his emotional reaction to all of this?
He used the word abandoned all over again. He said that his experience at the shack made him feel abandoned all over again, like he did in his home, and that he felt very sad, worthless. He described feelings of worthlessness and sadness and just very, very low mood when he was in this shack.
And did anything happen during that holiday in terms of psychiatric symptoms?
Yes. He experienced, he heard and he saw what he referred to as a demon, as a shack demon. And, excuse me, he described hearing a voice telling him, come with me, something to the effect of, I actually want to use his exact words, the demon basically said, you're a failure, you're alone, nobody cares, you need to be with me, I can take care of you. And he also saw this demon, and the demon was this dark figure. He said that it felt bigger than him, like it was standing over him. It was wearing like a heavy cloak, and he said that it engulfs me, is the way that he describes it. And he said that the feeling that's brought on by this demon experience is, he says that he feels a lot of, he doesn't feel fear. I asked specifically if he feels fear. He said no, he doesn't get scared, that what he feels is anguish and deep pain when he experiences this demon.
Now, is that important in terms of your diagnosis, the description that he feels anguish and deep pain as opposed to fear?
It is, because it is what we call a mood congruent psychotic feature. By that I mean he's depressed, he's experiencing a hallucination, and the content of this hallucination goes with the content of the depression. What the demon is telling him is consistent with a depressive theme, which is consistent with what he's experiencing in terms of emotions at that time.
Okay. And in terms of the chart that we put up earlier, where would this episode fall, or how would you diagnose this episode?
This episode was clearly, he would clearly have met diagnosis at this point. The only indication that we have was depression. So it definitely would have put him in that red zone of depression. For two reasons. One, he became psychotic during this depressive episode, and two, his mood was extremely, extremely low.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're ready to pause, and I'm going to go ahead and give you a break at this point in time. This is the Deputy Garrett. When I give you this break, do not discuss the case. I'll allow anyone to discuss the case with you. Do not sit near anyone who may or may not be discussing the case. If you do decide to have a meal at a local restaurant here or here, once I release for this particular break, do not remain on the fifth floor. Don't be interacting with anyone you should not interact with, anything you cannot hear. Do not read or look at any media coverage pertaining to this case. Do not go upon the internet and do research about this case. Do not blog or write about this case while it's ongoing. Do not go to any location that may or may not have been misrepresented during the course of the proceedings. All the evidence will come to you in the form of sworn testimony from the witness stand and on any physical evidence that's introduced in the trial and on any stipulations that were agreed to by the lawyers. You're more than welcome to bring something to snack and or eat with you during the afternoon session. Do not consume any alcoholic beverages during the lunch break. Deputy Garrett will turn back over to you. Your communication devices, this is your opportunity to return phone calls, return text messages, return emails, or communicate with whoever you want to during this time period. When you return, if you could, and you've been great so far, put your telephone or communication device in the off position. That way they won't be vibrating if you put them on silent. So it's been great, and thank you to all of you that have been complying with those requests. The lawyers and the parties cannot talk or interact with you. I don't ever want you to think they're being rude or discourteous. Although obviously you've seen them and they've seen you, so you have some familiarity with each other. But don't think they're being rude or discourteous. You can continue to leave your notepads there in the jury room. Just turn them face down. No one's going to look at your notes but you. If you need additional notepads, Deputy Garrett will provide additional notepads after the break if you need additional notepads, so you can take as many notes as you wish. We're going to be back in session, at 1:30. So if you need to make any arrangements for the afternoon session, go ahead and make those telephone calls right now. That way you don't have to send out a note asking Deputy Garrett to send me a note telling you you need to make a phone call. That's what this break is for you to communicate with whoever you want to. And always remember, during this break, you can go anywhere you want to. If you need to go visit somebody, do it now and just be back on time. So do all, if you need to pick up laundry, you do anything you want to. Just be back here at 1:30. And I said, and I always have to mention this, like I mentioned before, it's a 25% chance of rain. I think it rained early this morning, but give yourself enough time. If you remove your car from the parking garage, to park in the deck, you got to come back through the metal detector. There may or may not be a line at that point in time. You have to come up to the 5th floor, but just give yourself enough time to do all the things. You've been great up to this point. Everyone's on time this morning, and I love it. I like it. I should say I prefer it. People being on time because you really can't be late. All right, we're going to be in recess until 1:30. 1:30 today. Deputy Garrett, 1:30. All right. Lawyers, may approach. Please be safe, ladies and gentlemen.
Sorry.
All right, Mr. Deputy, we'll be in recess till 1:30.
All rise.
Which ones do you want to see? The ones that I you can look at the whole thing. This one. Now, some of that I have not presented yet.
I understand. You have it with in preparation of your testimony.
That's right. Yep, that's it.
Is this something that you prepared or the attorneys prepared?
This is something from the attorneys that we're going to be putting in.
Okay. So you didn't prepare this yourself? No. Is that your writing on it?
That's not right.
Okay.